For almost half a century, the entire planet was basically holding its breath, caught between two nuclear-armed superpowers. The Cold War, it defined everything: politics, culture, even our fears. And then, poof, it just ended. So how on earth does one of history's most intense standoffs simply dissolve? Right? That's the big question here. A 45-year global stare-down doesn't just stop because of one treaty or one person. Nope. It was more like a cascade of events, a mix of miscalculations, economic desperation, and some truly revolutionary ideas from a few key people. So let's dive in and break down how this whole thing came apart. So, where do we start? Well, funny enough, our story begins not with a huge fight, but with a surprisingly cooperative moment. After staring right into the nuclear abyss during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides kind of realized, okay, we need to pull back. This whole era got a name, détente. Yeah, it all came down to this one French word, détente. It literally means relaxation, and that just perfectly captures what was going on. It was this conscious effort to, turn down the heat, even though that deep-seated mistrust between the two superpowers, oh, that never really went away. That Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, that was the big wake-up call for everybody. Fast forward a decade, and you have President Nixon making these absolutely groundbreaking moves. He goes to the Soviet Union and signs the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And then, get this, he visits Mao's Communist China. I mean, this was a radical shift in how things were done. But let's be clear, détente wasn't born out of some newfound friendship. Oh no. It was born out of pure necessity. Both superpowers were dealing with massive problems at home. You've got the US, totally bogged down in the Vietnam War with its economy hurting. Meanwhile, the USSR had a completely stagnant economy and was dealing with a hostile China right on its border. Both of them desperately needed a break. But, a truce like this, it's like walking on eggshells. It was just not built to last. That underlying ideological battle was still raging just beneath the surface, and it was about to flare up in a big way, pushing the world right back to the edge. And boom, this was the moment everything changed. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 just completely blew up any trust and cooperation that had been built. To the West, this looked like old-school Soviet expansionism, and just like that, the entire policy of détente was declared dead. And then Ronald Reagan comes onto the scene, and boy, does the whole vibe change. He just tossed out all that careful language of cooperation. He replaced it with this moral condemnation, a super aggressive new stance. And he famously slapped the Soviet Union with a new label, the Evil Empire. And look, this wasn't just talk. The stakes were terrifyingly real. Let this number sink in. By the early 1980s, each side had over 12,000 nuclear warheads pointed right at the other. The threat of total annihilation was as high as it had ever been. So Reagan pulls out this wild card, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as everyone called it, Star Wars. The idea was to build this space shield that could shoot down Soviet missiles. It sounded like science fiction, but to the Soviets, it was a nightmare. They're looking at this and thinking, wait, this could neutralize our entire nuclear arsenal. It basically forced them into a crazy expensive arms race in space that they knew, deep down, they just couldn't win. Okay, so while the US is turning up the heat on the outside with all this military and tech pressure, inside the Soviet Union, things were starting to seriously fall apart. The cracks in the foundation of the empire were getting too big to ignore. The war in Afghanistan, well, that became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and the costs were just staggering. It was a black hole sucking up money and lives. It shattered the myth of the invincible Red Army, and it didn't even achieve its goals. It was this bleeding wound that the system just couldn't heal. And Afghanistan was really just a symptom of a much deeper problem. The whole centralized communist economy was grinding to a halt. Store shelves were empty, people were tired. After decades of propaganda, they were just deeply cynical about a system that promised a worker's paradise but delivered nothing but stagnation. And right into this massive crisis steps one of the most important figures of the entire 20th century. A man who saw the writing on the wall and decided, I have to take a radical gamble to save this thing. But in the process, he accidentally set the stage for its total collapse. So when this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in 1985, he was just different. He was younger, he was more dynamic, and he totally understood that the Soviet Union could not keep going down the same road. Now, he wasn't trying to destroy communism. He was actually trying to save it through some seriously radical reform. Gorbachev's big plan had two main parts. First was perestroika, which was all about restructuring the broken economy. But the idea that really changed everything was glasnost, which means openness. For the first time ever, citizens could openly criticize the government. Gorbachev thought this was key for reform, but what he really did was open a Pandora's box that he would never be able to close. Gorbachev's new approach led to this amazing thaw with the West. He and Reagan, these two guys who should have been mortal enemies, they actually developed this remarkable working relationship. They signed the historic INF Treaty, which got rid of an entire class of nuclear weapons, and then Gorbachev started pulling Soviet troops out of Afghanistan. Things were really changing. But Gorbachev's reforms, well, they had this massive, unintended consequence. By loosening the Kremlin's iron grip, he unleashed forces he could no longer control. And what followed was one of the most stunning and rapid political collapses in modern history. The chain reaction was just mind-blowing. Gorbachev announced he would no longer use Soviet tanks to prop up all those unpopular communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The second people realized the threat was gone, the floodgates just opened. That little taste of freedom from glasnost sparked these huge pro-democracy movements, and the entire Soviet bloc just started to crumble. The speed of the collapse was just breathtaking. In just a little over 2 years, the absolute unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell, Germany was reunified, the Warsaw Pact just dissolved, and then finally, in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself just ceased to exist. And just like that, the bipolar world that had defined everything since World War II was gone. The conflict that threatened nuclear Armageddon for decades ended not with a bang, but with a wave of popular revolutions and a complete political implosion. So, let's circle back. Why did it all end? It was truly a perfect storm. You had the external pressure from the US military buildup, combined with the internal rot from a failed war in Afghanistan and a totally collapsing economy. All those factors together created a crisis so big that not even a reformer like Gorbachev could contain it. And that brings us to our final thought. The end of this superpower standoff reshaped the entire globe. But it didn't end conflict, did it? It kind of just replaced one single terrifying threat with a whole bunch of new, complex challenges. Which leaves us with a really critical question to think about. Did the end of that clear, two-sided conflict actually make the world a safer place?